Hi, this is Chaz. I'm going to wait about another 15 or 30 seconds, a couple of more participants to join, and then we will start. But I can tell you both Ray and I are absolutely delighted now. We're seeing the number of participants and it's jumping up. So I think a lot of bugs are worked out of the system and hopefully the CRC can have more webinars in the future. I know that in my home state of Maryland, we find them to be an invaluable way of working with our members. Okay, this is Chaz. I'm going to go ahead and start the webinar. I'll be talking about recyclables and recycling markets in this most challenging business environment. But I want to start off with a question. What are recyclables? You know, we hear many reasons to recyclables, to save resources, to have a greener environment, to create jobs, to avoid disposal, to meet a legislated recycling goal or target. But we often forget that recyclables are simply raw materials for a manufacturer, and really they're nothing more or less. Recycling can create jobs. It is definitely good for the environment. It avoids disposal. But without markets, recyclables have no meaning. And worse yet, recyclables are commodities with fluctuating values, when all commodities have fluctuating values. And you see a chart of recycling markets, you see a bunch of ups, you see a bunch of downs, and every now and then you see a flat land. And the reality with recyclables is they have the biggest price fluctuations of all commodities. So let's say you're buying raw materials for a manufacturing plant. You want to find raw materials that have consistent quality and quantity at an acceptable price. Virgin raw material suppliers can easily meet both of those criteria. Secondary raw material suppliers, the people that supply recyclables, are now pretty consistent about quantity when it comes to curbside recyclables. But we continue to struggle with a consistent quality. And part of this is very simple. It's because you and the other 3.5 million residents of Connecticut's are simply, they're the suppliers. You're the suppliers, and collectively we, and I say this for Maryland too, lack the discipline of the much smaller universe of virgin raw material suppliers. Now, traditionally, like all commodity markets, recycling prices were defined by supply and demand. Or actually, more precisely, demand and supply. There's a saying in the scrap industry among veteran scrap dealers that recyclables, scrap, are bought, not sold. And no recycling program is immune from this economic reality. In the past, when demand for raw materials was high, recyclers could increase the supply of recyclables by paying more. When demand was low, they paid less to slow down supply. The rise of mandated recycling destroyed that equilibrium. Now the supply keeps rolling in regardless of need, and we are once again facing supply that is far outpacing demand. But we've been here before. There have been 5 major market drops since 1990, and one gentle slide, if you will. There was 1990, another collapse later in that decade, a downturn in the early aughts, the horror show of the summer of 2008, a steady decline starting in 2013, and now China. You know, veteran scrap dealers know they will lose money once every 4 years. They expect it, they plan for it. Why don't we? That's something we need to start putting into our plans, realities of these fluctuating markets. And the only real surprise about declining markets is their cause. 2 of the price drops were caused by normal economic ups and downs. 3, however, merit more attention. 1990, you had the flood of new programs. 1987 saw the voyage of the garbage barge. In fact, it was about 41 years ago to the day that it set out on its voyage, followed by a flood of new state recycling laws, a dramatic increase in the number of curbside programs, and the amount of material collected for recycling. As a result, individual markets were swamped. 2008 was caused by a combination of the decision of the Chinese government to shut down factories to encourage clean air for the Summer Olympics in Beijing, and also by the worldwide the recession the world went into when, for instance, the price of oil collapsed by $100 per barrel. Now, it took a long time for the recession to be over. Markets recovered within a year. Markets slid steadily for 6 months, bottomed out. And 6 months later, a year after the market collapse began, they were a little bit higher than they were before. 2017 was caused by a decision of the Chinese government to ban the importation of recyclables at the beginning of 2018. Now, recyclables have always been traded in global markets. However, until 2000 or so, domestic markets were far bigger for North American recyclables. Let's look at some numbers. Excuse me. Seem to be having a little trouble with my slides. I apologize for that. There. This is a data that on this and a few other slides will be from Hannah Zhao at RISI. Clearly, as this shows, the exports from the US and Europe increased dramatically from 2000 to 2016, the exports of paper to China, or exports totally, with China being by far the largest recipient of paper. And the reason for this is actually fairly simple. In the mid-90s, China started to become a market for our recyclables. For a number of reasons, China is not rich in forests. A number of very large, ultra-modern paper mills have been needed. They had an absolutely insatiable appetite for the long fibers that are found in American recycled paper in particular, and especially in our corrugated boxes. And they were also designed to process curbside mixed paper for its long fiber constituents. They could use 10-fingered pickers for quality control, and they benefited from low shipping cost. And let's look at this from the other perspective. Chinese imports of recycled paper for use as a raw material, furnish. 2005, 45% of the raw material used to make paper or paperboard in China was recycled content, was imported paper. 11 years later, that was only 36% as they greatly increased the amount of virgin pulp they shipped in to use and the amount of domestic recyclables. Interestingly enough, of the imports that they get, 60% are old corrugated paper because they have those long fibers, they're easily available, and the quantity and the quality is consistent. Now, the US, Europe, and Japan are primary suppliers of recyclables at roughly equal percentages. However, Japan has an advantage because the paper it supplies is cleaner and the country is closer. So what did China do to lower imports of recyclables so that furnish would go down as it did? Three things. The Green Fence, which was launched in 2013 as a way to prevent garbage from being concealed in bales of recyclables. I mean, we should be candid with each other. Scrap dealers have always pushed the limits to see what they could get away with. And the reality is people were shipping bales of garbage to China very thinly disguised as bales of recyclables. The Green Fence was a response. It included tighter contamination requirements with inspections at MRFs, the shipping docks, and tightened import licenses. Then a year ago, in February, China launched the National Sword as its second anti-contamination campaign. But at least in this country, the National Sword was pretty much ignored because it didn't do anything. We'd cleaned up our act for what the National Sword was looking for. In fact, a year ago at Waste Expo in the paper market session, the National Sword was barely referred to, and then only in relation to plastic and the impact it was already having on plastics. In July, China announced its intention to ban the importation of a number of recyclables, including unmixed, unsorted mixed paper and mixed plastics, a bunch of other things, metals, and a whole bunch of textiles. This ban is often conflated with the National Sword, but they're actually two very different things. And the ban is often erroneously called a ban on all recyclables, which it very clearly is not. But let's look at the import ban a little more closely. What it involves is a revised permit management system with reduced allocations for solid waste imports and with lowered contamination limits. Now, what we've seen so far is, according to a gentleman from Li and Man, which is the second largest of the Chinese paperboard mill companies, presentation that he did at the Waste Management Sustainability Conference early in February, paper mills are seeing cuts of 15 to 20% in the imports they're allowed to bring in. Now, the first round of imports was about 2.3 million tons, and I've heard that there have been another round with a higher amount of allowed in. There are no permits for paper, for small mills, or for traders. As for plastics, virtually barely noticeable the amount that's been allowed in, under 100,000 tons. And very tighter contamination limits were announced. And because of those new contamination limits, we now have 3 levels of specifications governing recyclables. First, you have the ISRI level. And the ISRI specifications are a baseline way of communicating what is meant and what is acceptable for different grades of metal, plastic, and paper recyclables. They are the most widely used standard specifications because they establish a common language and agreed upon levels of contaminants and prohibitives. However, there's also the buyer's specifications because sometimes buyers have their own specs based either on what they need or what they will pay for. And this specification is even more important, but it has problems. Because when buyers knowingly buy contaminated materials, they're just encouraging more and more. And that was clearly going on for a period when we were shipping all this stuff. Those bales were being accepted. And it's the paradox of hot markets. They do encourage lower specs. But the flip side of that is brokers and suppliers who continue to focus on quality and continue to supply a clean bale usually get rewarded when markets are tight. But most importantly, we now have a specification set by an importing country. This new requirement is no more than 0.5% contamination. It went into effect on March the 1st. It was higher than the originally announced 0.3%, but it's lower than the previous and not always enforced 1.5%. I mean, this is the reality. Bales of paper and plastic to be imported into China have to be almost purer than ivory soap. So why are the Chinese doing this? Very simple. They want a clean environment. China has a growing middle class. They want to enjoy the benefits of affluence in a clean environment. And this is absolutely no different than in the United States during the City Beautiful movement of the late 1800s, when there was sort of a strong movement to clean up cities because of all the smog, the pollution of the Industrial Revolution, led to organized garbage collection, and led to some of the earliest, very different from today, but some of the earliest curbside recycling programs. So what are the Chinese goals in this program? Very simple. They want to limit their reliance on foreign waste. They want to increase the use of domestic recyclables. They are buying virgin pulp. And they want to increase the size of domestic forests. So that's going to take a while. Now, one of the most important elements of that is increasing the use of domestic recycling. There's a big campaign on to require recycling in all the different provinces and cities, just like you see here in the States. Large city plans are due in 2 years. There's a problem here that's not widely acknowledged, but the real domestic recycling rate now may be higher than government estimates. The government, for a number of reasons having to do with how this data is estimated, may be underestimating by 5 or 20% the actual recycling rate in China. If that's correct, that's going to increase more pressure. Good news for us in a way, more pressure to get our exports. But let's look at the idea that our recyclables are foreign waste. You know, are recyclables garbage? Well, if you read the Chinese press, the ban is almost routinely referred to as a ban on foreign garbage. That's the term that's always used. So think about this for a minute. They are calling our and Europe's and Canada's recyclables to be garbage. Now, this is really driven by revulsion over the horror shows at some Chinese recycling facilities. I think everybody's seen the pictures of the electronics at Guiyu and some other facilities, and some of the pictures of plastics. The documentary Plastics China, which came out last year, it was widely circulated through the country. Many small paper mills, many plastic recycling facilities, and other recycling facilities lacked even the most basic environmental controls. And those are all being shut down, simply put out of business. And the reality is we passed recycling laws without thinking who wanted them as raw materials. And now we're paying the price for the failure of waste exporters to send quality raw materials, and then the failure of the Chinese government to control recycling facilities. But they are now working aggressively to eliminate those facilities and what they imported. I did it again. But are curbside recyclables garbage? Well, it's really all in the nose of the beholder. And this is something we have to pay attention to because this is the reality. Finished paper products have a low moisture rate, about 3%, 4%. Paper and MSW's got a higher moisture rate, can be double that because it's mixed with wet waste. And you take paper, whether it's OCC or mixed paper, you bale it, you put it in a container, you ship it across the ocean. You open that container 2 or 3 months later, there will be a smell. It's unavoidable. That raises a very important question. Are any of the companies or brokers that are baling recyclables, putting them in a container, shipping them across the ocean, are they looking for ways to lower this naturally occurring decomposition? Now, for commercially generated OCC, this is a very minor problem. Shouldn't be that big a problem for residential OCC. It will be a problem for mixed paper because mixed paper's got moisture attached to parts of it. It's a very big problem for plastics because baled plastic containers are definitely likely to contain food or water or other liquids. And one other thing that's worth noting here, you know, these requirements that are imposed on imported recyclables are not being applied to domestically collected recyclables in China. Now, that's technically a violation of trade agreements, but in the current environment, I don't think that argument's going to carry any weight. So, some obvious questions, some unknowns. What exactly will be enforced? What level of contamination will the government enforce? What is considered to be unsorted mixed paper? Because all mixed paper that gets shipped is sorted. How consistent will inspectors be? And it's very important, you know, the key is the March 1st deadline for the 0.5% contamination rate. I was speaking on China and markets at a conference in Toronto last week, and had some very good talks with some of the Canadian paper companies and paper recyclers. And one of the comments they made was two things, one of which is paper simply not being exported out of Canada at the moment, whether it's Toronto or Montreal or Vancouver. But their biggest concern is they don't know what requirements the inspectors in China will enforce on a bale of paper. There's a lot of confusion over what they're going to be looking for. And this raises some major issues because you're not going to want to ship corrugated or any other recyclables if you don't know what the enforcement requirements are going to be. Now, key to all of this might be, as Hannah Zhao put it, how does the government view the paper industry, the revenues, the jobs, the importance to the economy of the Chinese paper and paperboard industry? Have they complained about what's going on? Have they said they're going to be in economic problems? My suspicion is that they quietly commented when these were first announced. But let's be serious. You're dealing with a country with a president for life who has put his philosophy into the Constitution. The government's not likely to back down publicly. And I know a lot of logical reasons why the Chinese government will have to change. The mills need inexpensive fiber. The value of long fibers, especially in American OCC, is high. The skyrocketing price the mills are having to pay for domestically generated waste paper in China, and the cost to import virgin pulp from North America, this stuff is not cheap. This is a real cost for the mills. But don't always expect rational economic behavior. You got to remember that Richard Thaler won the Nobel Economics Prize this year for his work on behavioral economics and the reality that people and governments don't always make rational economic decisions. Over the long term, the Chinese government is likely to come to an understanding of what is good and bad for its economy and environment. You know, markets always bat last. But the immediate issue is how much pain will we suffer in the short term. So, some predictions. Given the uncertainty facing exports to China, I think, any prediction is a shot in the dark. As Adam Mentor, who's the author of Junkyard Planet, said, anyone who says they know what will happen in China is wrong. And this is even trickier given the reality that the prices indices rely on, especially for paper, are themselves relying on a much smaller universe of sources and are becoming a little bit less reliable. Nonetheless, I want to hazard some guesses, and the easiest prediction is very simple. Expect 6 to 12 months at least of turbulence for paper. Expect depressed markets for OCC. Be lucky to get markets for mixed paper, paid markets, good solid paid markets. It's going to take a while for this to sort out. Plastic is a little better off, and there was an article in Resource Recycling yesterday about, quote, markets show generally positive plastics pricing. The average price of post-consumer PET went up 3% from last month. The HDPE has also gone up. It's gone up about 6%. Colored HDPE has gone up. Film and mixed, though, are not doing well. And I think mixed plastics is probably the politest term, is highly challenging for the next 12 months. It's just going to be a difficult market. So, should we abandon hope? I mean, this is a pretty kind of gloomy prediction. I don't see any reason to abandon hope. Recyclers are inherently optimistic. You've got to be optimistic if you're going to survive in this business. And most importantly, on the paper side, 60% of imported paper is OCC. Once we understand what inspectors are looking for, and hopefully it's going to be rational what they look for and how, commercial load should be able to hit that grade, and I think residential load should also. But that raises the question, what do we do about residential mixed paper and about mixed plastics? Well, the first thing is obvious: quality. Quality, quality, quality. It matters more than ever. The cleaner the bale, the less the worry. Connecticut processors have a very good reputation for what they ship. Partially, this is you got a bottle bill. There's less glass potentially in the bales. But even the best will be challenged by a 0.5% contamination limit. They're going to be slowing down processing lines. They'll be buying more sophisticated equipment. Waste Management publicly said about 2 weeks ago, they're seeing a $20 per ton increase in the cost of processing mixed paper as they slow down those lines, as they start to upgrade their equipment. It's going to cost money. I think most importantly, we have to stop being in denial about commodity prices. They fluctuate. Why have we not learned this lesson? Maybe we need to rely on 5 or 10-year averages instead of the price du jour. Maybe what the Casella Company is doing with their sustainability commodity adjustment that they do every month on their bills, maybe that's the approach to take. But we have to start accepting price fluctuations, which we've been amazingly tone deaf to over the years. And a little bit of heresy, because sometimes heresy is good. Maybe we need to rethink unrealistic recycling goals did not have recyclables as raw materials as their primary purpose. So what about our options? Domestic markets. Clearly, increasing domestic capacity is one option. After all, one person's problem is another's opportunity. And a vast amount of raw materials available, and it's got a lot of brown paper in it, got a lot of brown fiber in it, which mills want. We will see mills changing their stock preparation systems to accommodate this new stream. That is going to happen. Pratt Recycling announced a new box mill in Ohio that uses mixed paper. Pratt Recycling is America's largest mixed paper market. That mill is scheduled to open probably in late 2019, which means they'll probably be buying up a couple of months before as they do mill tests and as they start to build up inventory for when they go to full operating. Recycled content requirements are a possibility, whether they're legislated or whether they're brand driven. The thing that APR is doing on plastic recycling demand champions, that's great. I wish the glass industry would do the same thing, a glass recycling demand champion among its brand owners. But getting those brands to step up and saying, we want recycled content. That's what we need more of. Will the new tax bill help? Or the new tariffs? Well, there we may have some really interesting, dueling, mutually destructive, counterproductive policies. The tax bill clearly would be beneficial for buying the equipment needed to upgrade mills and MRFs. You talk to people who work with MRFs, processors, their order books are full. They can sell all the new equipment they can make, especially the more technically advanced and more reliable equipment. However, what about the negative impact of steel and aluminum tariffs? Look at a MRF. What's the single biggest material physically in that MRF? It's steel. It's those ladders, those catwalks, those girders, those supports, the equipment. So MRFs are going to take a hit. Any new MRF, any reconfigured MRF is going to take a hit. And if that processing is equipment is made in the States, those manufacturers will be paying more for the steel. And you can't reconfigure a MRF overnight. So I think that may end up being a wash. What about other options? Asian markets. We know that Southeast Asian mills and processors are becoming bigger markets, but we also know they have less capacity than China. We know they will pay less, and we know they may well erect barriers if scandals ensue from people shipping garbage disguised as recyclables. However, there's a really bright spot in this particular area. Chinese plastic recycling processors and plastic companies are considering partnering with American processors. They want to increase U.S. processing capacity. They see easy entrance from what is processed in this country into Chinese markets. They toured the country after the Plastics Recycling Conference a month ago to meet with prospective partners. And we've already seen two announcements, not necessarily at all from this initiative, but one in Alabama and one in South Carolina by Chinese plastic recycling firms. One building a plastic grinding and pelletizing facility in Alabama, shipping the product to China as a raw material. And an announcement just earlier this week of a similar facility in South Carolina that I believe will also be taking mixed paper. So there's interest out there, but again, it takes 6 months or longer to get one of these facilities in operation, get it working, and get it to buying and processing raw materials. So it's going to take a while. So these are definitely challenging times. I was thinking how to do the last slide, and when I was in Canada, I joked that maybe I should have had a clip of Gloria Gaynor singing "We Will Survive" or Little Orphan Annie singing "Tomorrow," or perhaps most telling, the song from the Poseidon Adventure, "The Morning After." I mean, maybe I needed to be something really upbeat and vocal, but I didn't because it's too complex for my web skills. These are challenging times. There's no doubt about it. They are absolutely no worse, however, than the market collapse in 1990 when curbside was taking off. The markets were down for 2 or 3 years. They were just horrible back then. The next 6, I think 12 months will be very challenging, especially for mixed plastics, also for mixed paper. And they will be somewhat challenging for OCC until we see how all the inspections will shake out. Better markets will return. We're already seeing that start to happen. It's only a matter of time. Recycling has faced similar challenges in the past. But the bigger question is, what have we learned? And what will we do differently going forwards, especially in terms of accepting the reality that we're dealing with commodities with fluctuating price. And it's definitely a challenge to the model we've always used for paying for recyclables. That's why I think the Casella thing with the adjustable charge based on commodity prices may be one indication of the wave of the future on how we do our programs. So with that, I'm going to finish. I appreciate your patience and my occasional awkwardness with the slides. At the end of this, I do have a list of links of people in the industry who I think are very knowledgeable, good resources for knowledge about trends and where markets are going. I'm happy to take any questions. And I know we had one chat room question that was sent in, if I can get over to it. It was a question, the worldwide paper demand has not dropped. So China is no longer providing that demand. How is the demand being met? Is this a long-term development or a short-term blip? I think I already answered a good chunk of that in the presentation. I think it's a medium-term blip actually. Problems like this do have their own opportunities. There are a lot of people who see the opportunities. We're already starting to see that play out a little bit with the 2 new processing facilities in the South, with the new Pratt mill in Ohio. But another thing we have to, that sort of makes prediction hard is what's going to happen with those inspectors. What will they be looking for? And how consistent will they be when they're inspecting bales in China? So I hope that answers that question. And if anybody has any other questions, I'm happy to take them. Do we have any, Ray?
No.
Well, if you've got any questions for me you'd like to send me, my email is chazmiller9, chazmiller9@gmail.com. I'd be happy to take your questions. They can arise later today, next week, whenever. I'll be happy to answer them. I appreciate your time. I appreciate your patience as Ray and I went through our own little learning course on webinars. So Ray, that's it. Thank you. And thank you to the Connecticut Recyclers Coalition.